So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another lecture in the LSBU Business School Professional Lecture Series. My name is Neil Hudson-Basing. I'm the Corporate Events Manager at LSBU, and today I'll be introducing Dag Bennett, whose talk is entitled Data in Funny Places. But before I do, I would just like to take you through some virtual housekeeping, starting with a short statement on respect and dignity. Everyone speaking at or attending an LSBU event, whether in person or virtually, should be treated with respect, dignity, and courtesy. LSBU operates an environment built on equality, inclusion, and acceptance. We value contributions, feedback, and comments, and wish to create a space for sharing, learning, celebrating, and bringing communities together. LSBU does not tolerate any form of bullying, abuse, harassment, or discrimination. Inappropriate behaviour, including that potentially impacts or contradicts LSBU's reputation and values, will be treated seriously and acted upon. Anyone exhibiting any example of this behaviour will also be removed from the webinar. We want our events to be an enjoyable, safe, and warm experience for all. Thank you for adhering to these guidelines. Just to take you through the Zoom functionality quickly, you'll see that I've enabled closed captioning, which are the subtitles that you can see just at the bottom of the screen. You can hide those by clicking on the little up arrow next to the CC live transcript button. And if you don't wish to see those, you can remove those there. Next, we have the chat box, and I'd like to encourage you to use the chat box throughout today's event. Share your thoughts, comments, network. It helps us to break down the virtual wall that we're all experiencing at the moment. We are quite keen for an interactive session today. So if you have any questions throughout or after the lecture during the Q&A, feel free to pop your camera and mics on to ask them. We'll get some dialogue going, but equally, if you're more comfortable using the chat box, then please do so. The event is being recorded and will be shared on our YouTube channel afterwards. And I'll share the link in the chat box because it contains all of the other lectures that have taken place under the professional lecture series across the three lots of events that we've organised. That's all from me. I'll be in the background if you have any questions. Dag, over to you.
Okay, thank you. I share my screen now. Do you all see data in funny places?
We can.
All right, great. All right, so thank you very much for coming. I know it's a beautiful day, so you had choices and you don't have to be here, and thanks for being here for now. I'm going to talk about data, and I'll give you a couple examples of what I've done with data that has come from funny places. How do I scroll down? Okay. Yeah, so this lecture is kind of for students who are looking for projects and sources of data for answering their research questions, or for academics who are writing papers. And of course, the key thing that you've got whenever you're trying to answer a research question is, where does the data come from? You can buy it, you might create it, or what I'm talking about here is mostly about finding it because it already exists someplace else. And you know, in an era of big data, there's an awful lot of data hanging around. So I'll go through the first couple here, the data made public and nerd power, briefly, because mostly what I'll talk about today is a paper that's come out of an archive. So data made public, we have things like the Office for National Statistics. For example, they have a taking part survey that's been running for about 25 years, which tracks everything that people do with their time. And they make all that data available to you. In fact, they package some of it up in reports, and they have all these seminars and various things you can do to learn how to manipulate the data in any way you choose fit. The US Census Department tracks all kinds of United States data, and they claim to have nearly 300,000 data sets. And you just get on there and play with the data like you want. There really aren't any boundaries to what you can do with the data, although there are some regulations about, you know, citing it and making sure that you're using it in appropriate ways. And then you've got organizations like Google, Amazon, Pew Heritage Trust, the World Bank, the W Health Organization, et cetera, that have big data sets, depending on what you want to look at. If we're talking about business, then organizations like the World Bank are extremely useful when talking about you know, what happens in business and survival and new startups and all the various things that they support in terms of international trade. So it all sort of falls out like this. This is a slide that I stole from somewhere, but this is about how a big data strategy can utilize different sources of information. And, other people can talk about things like machine data, or archive data, or multimedia files that come from places like Amazon and Google. This isn't anything new. It just here we're sort of emphasizing the point that there's a tremendous amount of data floating around. Um, it's not anything specific to your particular questions, but you can make it that way if you've got some data management chops. So here are some examples of a couple of papers that came out of the taking part data, segmenting the data market in England by Hand and Singh. And here's a paper that I was involved in, which is about the competitive landscape for leisure, why wide appeal matters, which is a paper started by John Scriven, which basically looks at how people use their time for entertainment. The original title of that paper, by the way, was Down at the Pub with the Culture Vultures, which basically says, you think of a culture vulture as only doing things like going to the opera or highfalutin kind of entertainment, but in fact, they do all kinds of other things as well, which is what we found in that paper, is that people don't just have one particular thing that they do, they spread their activity and time around lots of different ones. Here we have some nerds. Nerds, it's not really an effort to insult people. A lot of nerds describe themselves as nerds. And these are particular types of nerds who are interested in collecting things. So who do you think the nerds in the center picture are, the black and white picture? Who do you think they are? What's their passion? Any ideas?
We've got a comment saying learning in the chat box.
Learning. Those are train spotters. You've heard of them, right? How about the ones on the left?
Bird watchers.
Not birds, no, close.
Planes?
Airplanes, they're plane spotters.
Planes, but yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Close
And
enough.
on the right, behind the camera, ship spotters. Here's an easy one. Bottom right, what do you think those guys are looking for?
A way in.
What?
A way in, entry.
They're truck spotters.
You're joking.
No, these things actually exist.
All right.
Yeah, the ones on the far left, that's from something called deep fake spotting. And the ones in the middle, those ladies are actually engaged in a data gathering exercise that looks, it's about eye health. And Peak Vision has this program where these teachers all over the world take pictures of the backs of their students' eyes, and then they upload those images to a site. And then people spend a tremendous amount of time looking at these images. And some people are really, really good at spotting corneas that have some incipient eye disease on them. And then they notify the various health professionals, and then, that can be addressed. So what we're looking at here is nerds in the best sense of the word, which is that they are tremendously detail oriented and interested in the thing that they are interested in, to an extent that we really can't fathom for most of us. So there are organizations like Peak Vision I just mentioned. We've got train spotting, and these are just a small sample. If you go, for example, to shipspotting.com, I don't know how many members they've got, but I do know that they've got 1.3 million pictures of ships. So if you're looking for a picture of a ship, that's the place to go. Likewise, Plane Spotters has something like 100,000 members and about 1.5 million pictures of planes. So those spotters are really passionate about it, and they upload all these pictures. Now, they also do things like track all the various ships and planes, everything in the world that has to do with the thing of interest. And they're better at tracking data than a lot of the government organizations that they draw their data from. They clean up the data and then they make it available. So an example of the kind of research that might come out of these organizations are, the first one is about eye health in Kenya. And the second one is a paper that I presented in a conference, and it's going to be coming out fairly soon, that has to do with how airlines buy aircraft. This is kind of an extension of the buying behavior stuff that is based on consumer patterns, which we've been studying for years in data sets, and Charlie can talk about that as well. But now this is an effort to extend what we know about how consumers buy things to how airlines buy things. And here, the difference, of course, is that an aircraft is huge and expensive and complicated. And so you would think that in a professional or organizational buying setting, that the patterns that you'd find would be quite different from the way in which we buy toothpaste or the things that we buy all the time from supermarkets. The weird thing is they're not. Airlines buy aircraft in pretty much the same way that we buy everything else. So this is a paper that tries to explain why that might be. And that comes out of data gathered by nerds, to whom I'm tremendously grateful. The final main source that people can utilize are archives. And sometimes these come from public sources, or guilds, association, chambers of commerce, and companies often have archives, which I'll be talking about in more detail here in a second. Archives are all over the place, but they tend not to be terribly well known. They don't publicize them very much. So this is something that needs to be hunted out. London is kind of unique in that it has a whole bunch of guilds that also maintain archives, or rooms full of records and things like that. Not all of them are as well organized as they should be, and we can talk about that later. But there are rich troves of data and information you can find in the guilds across London, and usually they're very happy to share. Okay, so the research I'm talking about has to do with luxury goods. And this came about a few years ago because South Bank was doing some luxury goods degrees and modules. And we found in doing that, while we can talk about luxury goods, ad infinitum, there's not a whole lot that's known about the way in which people buy them. And so you end up with questions like, do people buy luxury goods in the same way that they buy non-luxury goods? Luxury goods are high involvement because they're expensive and you need to think about them a bit. And does that matter? Another question that might come out if you're thinking about historical luxury goods is, has behavior changed over time? And people face very different choices and buying environments now than they did before. Does that affect behavior? Some luxury goods manufacturers have been in business for a couple hundred years. Well, how do they do that? What strategies do they employ, and how do they do this difficult dance of staying in business for so long while the world is changing all around them? Straightforward questions like, do loyal customers keep you in business, which we're asking about in marketing all the time, as loyalty remains a big issue. The problem with luxury goods is that there's no longitudinal data, no purchase panels. There's little brand level data because most of the firms involved in luxury goods are small and craft focused. And part of their cachet, or the reason for being, is that they're exclusive. And that means that they don't want to tell you very much, especially about their customers. They really value confidentiality. So in the academic literature, there's a lot of stuff about motivation and attitudes and showing off or conspicuous consumption and all that kind of stuff, but nothing really about buying. So that's the gap that we're trying to fill here. We have this buyer behavior void about luxury buying behavior. All right, so here's Savile Row. I don't know if any of you have a really nice suit. I hope you do. But here's where some of the nicest suits in the world are made. Savile Row has been around about 300 years, and in its current form, about 200 years. And so I sort of got lucky. I called around the various tailor shops that have been around for a couple hundred years, and found one called Henry Poole, which actually has an archive. And that archive consists of these tremendous ledgers in which the shop assistants at the time would record all the customers' purchases. And so there are something like 150 ledgers, and they are all about 1,000 pages with a great deal of detail about what people were buying, how much they were paying. And I'll show you some of the pages here in a moment. You'll get an idea of what these archives display. So basically, it was about going into the basement where these tremendous ledgers are kept. And you can see that there's quite a lot of them. They started in about 1840 and they run up to about 1954, when the records were not kept on ledgers anymore. They began a card system and later on an electronic system. So we're looking at about 100 years of continuous buying data. Henry Poole also used to be sort of the holder of uniforms and things like that. So in the bottom right-hand picture, you see a dress hat for some sort of lord. And when there were ceremonial functions, the lords would all come, change into their fancy kit, go to their function, come back, and leave the dress uniforms with Henry Poole. They're not really in that business anymore, but they still have some of that stuff around. So when you look inside these books, here's the kind of thing that you see. You can see that this is His Excellency the General A. Ferrero. And you can see that he's bought some black suits and some shirts and what he's paid for them. It takes a while to work out how to read this stuff because it's all handwritten in a fairly interesting copperplate script. You'll see a couple of things there up on the left-hand corner. It says late, which means that he died. And that's a common feature of the records here. People are noted when they're dead. And there's a little newspaper clipping there, which says that the death is announced at Rome of General Ferrero, formerly Italian minister in London, which is why he was at Henry Poole. So this is the kind of records that we're looking at. This guy bought during the time period that we're looking at, not all the time, but he has a record that spans about 10 years. And there are lots like that. Alfred Cleggett, his record is kind of sad because he wound up overspending himself and wound up a vagrant. And this was at a time when you could be jailed for being a vagrant. So that's what this newspaper article on the bottom left is about. You'll also see that up in the corner, CD 7431, that's the page number. You see it's 1892. And those page numbers are important because the end of this article or the notation for this particular customer will say where the next record is, because one customer can have 15 different records in 10 different books, and you need a code to figure out where it is. But those notes are all there. So these are the kind of clothes we're talking about, mostly, although they did all kinds of other things. And you also find these kind of interesting notes. For example, this guy has a note that says he must pay cash. Why do you think that is?
Because he has a history of not paying.
Yeah, exactly. And there's a lot of that in here.
Yeah, Savile Row.
In fact, Henry Poole ended up kind of being a bank, because a lot of these guys would stretch out their payments or non-payments over years. And that was especially true for some of the bigger customers. At the top of the page, it says, recommended by brother Alex D. Lasky. And this is another thing that you find throughout here, is that it's not just the person that we're talking about, but also how they got introduced. And then it talks about some member of the chamber of His Excellency or something or other. So you can see the connection. This is networking information. And this is important because this is primarily how the business was expanded. People would introduce people. All right, so in the data, we've got 132,000 individuals, 57 kings, 4 emperors, Kaiser Bill and Buffalo Bill. So it's showmen, it's heads of state. In fact, there was a funny quote in one of the articles about Henry Poole, which said that Henry Poole was the director from like 1860 to 1876. And the quote is, "He was a tailor by appointment to all the crowned heads in the world of any note." Just let that sit there for a moment. So there's this exclusivity thing going on here, and it permeates the record here. So the records, as you've seen, are purchase records of items, prices, payments, and from all these 132,000 individuals, I picked out a sample of 500, and I covered the decade between 1890 and 1899. The reason I did that is because I wanted a big enough sample to feel like it was representative of the whole data set, and it's big enough that the results are statistically valid. So what I was looking at was how much do people buy, how often, what do they spend, and I did some really simple stats like the averages. How much did they spend on average on any given year or any decade? And one of the things that became very clear very early on in looking at these records was that there were a lot of occasional buyers. In other words, in 10 years, you might have a bunch of people who only bought once or twice. That was fairly normal. And only 10% of all the customers of Henry Poole bought in all 10 years in the data. Those are the heavy buyers, or at least the regular buyers. So you look at the data like this, and it starts to feel fairly normal. These aren't exceptional kinds of levels of buying or repeat buying. They're fairly normal from what we know about in terms of consumer purchasing in other categories. So on average here, an annual spend of about 4,800 pounds. And the minimum was 19 pounds. By the way, these are translated into 2020 pounds rather than what they were in 1890. So a minimum spend of 19 pounds, which was probably a button repair or something like that, and a max of about 40,000 pounds per year. So you've got some people who are spending a tremendous amount on clothing. Over 10 years, people would spend an average about 26,000, and the maximum spent in 10 years was about £250,000 on clothing. So this is a pretty serious clothes force. When you divide out the top 20% of customers, in other words, the top spending 20%, they account for about 56% of all spending. In other words, the other 80% of customers account for the other half, the other 44%. And this too is a fairly normal finding that we can relate to other categories. What this distribution of purchasing looks like is what we call a negative binomial distribution. We don't need to get into the technicalities here because I'll show you what it looks like, and it's easily seen when you create a histogram. This becomes important that it fits the NBD because it means that buying has predictable patterns and that those patterns are relatable to a vast body of knowledge that's been built up in other categories. This, however, is the first application to luxury goods. Again, you have to find the data to show that the pattern exists, and that's what this archive is valuable for. So we can say, having analyzed the data, that the market is normal in terms of its distribution of buying frequency, all the various things we've come to expect. The model fits very well, and it doesn't really matter if you look at it by individual years or by purchases or by money spent or by the entire decade. The pattern still fits. And this allows us to compare this data against all the things that we already know. So this is a typical NBD. This is from 1893. And what you see here is that about 44% of all its customers didn't buy in the space of that year. In other words, they're customers of Henry Poole, but maybe every other year or even less. So they're infrequent buyers, and that's the bulk of the customers. Another 31% bought once in the space of a year, get a new suit every year. A couple got a couple suits, and so on and so forth. So that guy who spent £250,000 in 10 years is probably over there under number 6. But notice also that's only about 1% of all the buyers. There are some heavy buyers, but they're very rare. And that also is a pattern that we find in all different categories that we've looked at. Yeah, so that's the pattern that we see not just in 1893, but any other year we look at, or for the entire decade. What this allows us to say is that, this type of analysis, stochastic modeling, gives useful results. It opens up a new category or a historical category. It adds a time frame, and it allows us to talk about the continuity of buying theory. In other words, if you think about the way people buy things and why they do it, you start to wonder whether that has changed, despite the fact that we have many more choices these days, many more branded goods, lots more advertising and communication, blah, 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 blah. But the basic motives we have for buying things probably remain constant. So one of the things I think we're showing here is that historic data has value in modern marketing. One way to think about that is that you've got a bunch of these luxury goods manufacturers today who are doing things kind of like they've always done things. And that's good if you stay in business. That's good if you're thriving and growing, et cetera. But it's not very sort of empirically driven or focused on what actually works. And that's what this data is valuable for. It tells you what the patterns are, and it tells you what you should be doing with your strategy. And it makes it possible for luxury goods manufacturers to evaluate how their customer base looks and whether that's what they want, or how to alter their marketing strategies so that they get a better mixture of light or heavy buyers. In fact, you can say that one of the funny things is that if you think about loyalty, if your loyalty is seen to go up, you might think that's a good thing, because a lot of your marketing theory says, yeah, you want to improve loyalty. But in fact, if your loyalty goes up, it probably means that you're losing a lot of your light buyers, which means you're in deep trouble. So a lot of the things that come out of this are kind of counterintuitive. So we have clear implications for things like targeting. We can use the NBD to benchmark change in the customer base in response to marketing interventions. So here's what we learned by looking at data that's 130 years old, that the NBD applies now like it did then. It's consistent over time. In fact, a lot of the NBD theoretical stuff came out of a publication by Bortkovich in 1898, where he established the usefulness of NBD by looking at the incidence of deaths caused by horses kicking soldiers in the Prussian army. So he found that there were a few army units that had a lot of people kicked to death, but a whole lot of them that didn't have very many kicks at all. And this is what the NBD distribution looks like. A lot of zeros, a few ones, and very, very few at the high end. So the theory comes from 130 years ago, and it's still valid today. We also find that the Pareto share rules apply. Pareto is the proportion of the sales or purchases made by the big buyers, the heavy buyers. And here we're showing that it's about half, which is very much in line with all the other studies that we've done on Pareto share. So this all looks normal and predictable and like we like it to do. So another important implication of this is that if you're in luxury goods, then your survival depends on lots of occasional customers. They outnumber the heavy buyers by a lot. The heavy buyers are rare, and not only are they rare, but they're kind of unstable. In other words, they could be a heavy buyer one year and not in another. And when you look at it, sometimes you see these notes in the ledgers that say this guy has been promoted to admiral. So he comes in and buys a whole bunch of new admiral outfits. And that happens in one year, but then it doesn't repeat in subsequent years and things like that. So major events drive major purchasing, but they tend to be kind of rare. Also, in terms of surviving, some customers don't pay their bills. And if you are reliant on those heavy buyers and they're not paying their bills, then the thing that happens is that you become either insolvent or you have to shift strategy. And in fact, in about 1880, that's what they began to do by looking for more light buyers. And they opened offices in places like Vienna and Paris, and sent correspondents to New York, where a lot of their customer base was. And so they began to realize that dependence on people who bought a lot but didn't pay their bills was kind of a foolhardy thing. That's the same in 1890 as it is today. In fact, when I showed these results to Keith Levitt, the guy at the archive who runs this thing, he said, yeah, it's the same. Our customers are a third English or from the UK, a third European, and a third American. And that's true in 1890 as it is today. And I haven't seen the books for the modern buyers, but the managers say that what they're seeing in the historical data is very, very similar to what we have today. So that's reassuring in a way. So this is a paper that'll be coming out in the Economic History Review. And one of the things about archival data is that it tends to lend itself to the historical perspective, which is a little bit weird if mostly what you're writing about is marketing. So this is a big leap, and it's one of those slightly weird things that you have to do if you're using this type of data. The thing about historical writing is that it tends to be very, very data poor. It's about telling a story. The guys who write for Economic History Review have a narrative flow that's all about things and people and companies, but very, very little data, and certainly no statistical analysis. So this is a bit of a departure, and well, my co-authors and I hope that it is going to be as well received as some other sort of boundary jumping types of publications. So I've reached the end. I would love to hear if you have any questions or comments.
Thank you.
I've got a comment, Dag.
Should I unshare?
That's fine. I've done it for you.
All right, thank
That's
you.
fine. Thank you.
Lawrence, what's your comment?
Okay, the point about smaller customers and bigger customers fits with my past experience. A few decades ago, I used to work in well, quite a few decades ago now. I was a young salesman. My business was in industrial supplies, quite specialized stuff. And my sales manager had no education at all to speak of. We were talking in a sales meeting about the types of accounts we have. We had lots and lots of small ones and quite a few big ones. And my colleagues, I was quite new at that time, were boasting about the big customers they have. Yeah. The sales manager said, okay, it's great that we've got big customers. It's great that we get exceptional orders. But think about it. If you lose one of the small customers, you haven't lost very much. And we are continually gaining and losing. If you lose one of the big customers, you've lost a hell of a chunk of business. And for me, what you were saying fits with my past. Whether what I've just said fits with what you're saying is for you to decide. But it's an interesting phenomenon.
Yeah, well, common sense or, the conventional logic says that you should take great care in the tending of your biggest customers.
Oh, yeah.
The problem with that is that you tend to ignore the little ones,
yeah.
And then you get into trouble.
Yeah.
So it may be true that you should take care of the big ones, but you have got to put half your effort into the little ones because they're the ones who really support you in the long term.
Yeah, absolutely. They were also easier to talk to get to see, to make appointments with. Yeah. Thanks, Dag.
Yep. Thanks, Lawrence.
Up there.
Thanks, Lawrence. If there are any questions, please do feel free to pop your cameras and mics on. There's some great comments coming through, Dag. So there's that was great. Thank you very much. It was eye-opening. That was very interesting, especially as the data is not just about sales and money. It is a kind of social and international history too.
Yeah, well, this archive has been open to, people who are researching fashion and fashion history and art, because a lot of these guys had paintings made of them or they had photos taken of them. And so it's curious the sociologists and the fashionistas have been in this archive for years. I'm the first business guy that's been looking at it in this way. But yeah, it's an interesting archive.
Thank you. Charles, you're on camera. Would you like to ask a question?
Just a very quick, just a kind of technical question. I was really interested to see that Pareto ratio, because we've been kind of digging into it and getting fussed about it.
Yeah.
I wasn't, my mind was temporarily somewhere else. Did you work that out on the money or on the number of purchases?
On the money.
On the money.
Yeah.
And was that for a year, or was it?
We did it both for the years, each individual year, and for the entire decade.
Oh, brilliant, 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 brilliant. Because low, right? I mean, it's not very concentrated at all.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's fantastic. Really good.
Yeah. One thing that we could do, we haven't done yet, is look, you could, the data records the orders and it also records the payments. And so we could separate out how many of these guys were deadbeats, or how many of them, didn't live up to their obligations to pay. We can see that. And it's surprising. There are some guys who had hundreds of thousands of pounds worth of clothing that they stretched over years and years and years. It's the kind of thing where you can become captive to your debt.
Yeah. Well, that's absolutely the traditional thing, isn't it? You keep your unpaid tailor quiet by ordering another suit.
Yeah.
And so you just don't want heavy buyers like that at all.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, that's brilliant.
Yeah. No, there were Henry Poole, when he took over from his dad, started encouraging these customers to come hang out. So he'd open a bottle of port and put on some sort of club-like atmosphere, and people would show up and they'd hang out, and sometimes they'd buy things, but they were absolutely the wrong sorts of customers, because they were gay young blades and they didn't pay.
So it's a whole new CRM strategy.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Really great research. I think this is fantastic.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun to do.
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of arduous hanging out in the basement, but the old books themselves are really, really cool to work with. Did
they give you any sort of samples to encourage you, like a suit or a tie or anything?
I wish they would. That hasn't been mentioned. On the other hand, they don't look at me and say, "Boy, you're a bit scruffy," when I come in there either.
Well, they do. That's good.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Charles. So Anastasia says, such an exciting presentation, amazing data, makes me want to start my research even more. Colin asks, do large stores carry out this type of research? It should be possible just by counting bank account numbers, yes, and total spends.
Well, if they do, they don't publish it. I've never seen it. I would guess that most well-managed firms will do something like this, but it's not public. It's not academic. It's the kind of thing that you might do as a manager, but so we don't see it.
Thank you. If anyone else has a question, please do feel free to pop your camera on and ask it. You're very welcome to. We have another question in the inbox. Do you have a sense of the competition? I remember going to Rolls-Royce once in Chichester, where it emerged that the competition could be, say, Asprey's, a jewelers rather than Bentley.
Yeah, okay. So in a way, yes. I mean, there are a couple of other tailors on the road, like Huntsman, that have archives. And one of the developments of this is that I hope to be able to get in there to see if we have any customers in common. So, the problem with only looking at one tailor is you're sort of making the assumption that these guys only have one, but that's probably not entirely true. As for competition with other things that they're spending money on, yeah, that's undoubtedly true. And I think that there are people who have looked at the propensity to get into debt, or the spending mix of Victorian gentlemen. But that's not really accessible through the data that we have here. It would be very interesting to follow that, but we can't do it here.
Thank you. That's all the questions that we've got come through. Dag, I'm going to hand over to you for any parting words of wisdom or advice that you'd like to share.
Yeah, well, this is data in funny places. There's quite a lot of it around. I like the fact that it's free usually, but also more importantly, I think oftentimes it is designed to be easy, and I think easy is even more important than free. So the analysis here was just done with Excel. Previous papers, like with the taking part survey, are done with Excel. They don't have huge requirements to be a real data wonk to get into this data. So part of making the data accessible is making it easy to use, and most of these free sites are like that. So go forth and find it and use it. I will say one thing about archives, though. When you try to get something published, what they want to be able to do is see that your methodology would work if somebody else employed it. In other words, you have to be able to say, well, here's what I did, and anybody else could do this. And that typically means that you have an organized archive. It's not just a bunch of stuff in the basement. Yeah, it has to be accessible in a systematic way, and somebody else should be able to do that who isn't you. And if you can convince the reviewers of that, then you can say, well, this isn't just a chance occurrence, and I manipulated the data in a way that makes it interesting. So using archive data is relatively straightforward, but there are certain rules that have to be followed if you're trying for publication.
Dag, thank you very much for such an insightful presentation. Thank you to our audience for attending. This lecture will be uploaded to our YouTube playlist containing all of the lectures that have fallen under the Business School Professional Lecture Series LSBU. So thanks so much.
Been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dag.